Wobbly rock in a river. Okay, what we do for our art. Don't like this rock. Let's try another one. Okay, that's better. Hey, I'm Josh, and this is the Camera Project. I'm here in beautiful Clinton, New Jersey to review the Nikon Z6 while exploring the Red Mill Museum and the beautiful downtown. But first, I need a coffee. Not a bad spot for a coffee. New Jersey, been called the armpit of America. Today, we're here to prove not true. We're here in beautiful Clinton, New Jersey, reviewing the Nikon Z6. I have the Red Mill Museum behind me, and today we're going to use the Z6, take some photos, take some video, and see what this camera has to offer. I'd like to thank the people over at Lens Pro To Go for letting us borrow the Z6 and all the lenses today. If you're interested in trying out the Z6, please go to lensprotogo.com and see what they have to offer. They have the whole kit. You could even get the XQD card, which I did, because who has an XQD card? I know, D850, I get it. I get it, okay? So in terms of form factor, this camera is really nice. I think for me, it's kind of the sweet spot of mirrorless full frame. Whereas the Sony a7 III, which I'm shooting this with right now, is just a little bit too small. I'm not someone who likes to shoot with huge lenses, so it's really not too bad for me. But this is just a few millimeters larger in a few different directions, and it makes a big difference in that your pinky, or at least mine, doesn't fall off of it. And that's really nice. I also think the grip is a bit deeper, which feels really secure when you're holding a bigger, more heavy lens like this 24-70 2.8, which is brand new. Overall, I think the ergonomics of this camera are really good, and I think that's a lot of what's going to set this camera apart, because you kind of already know what's different or better with the Sonys compared to this, or even the Canons compared to this, because this camera's been out for a few months now. But what really does make this camera stand out is the ergonomics. Not just the handling physically, but a lot of the sort of smart things they've done with the menus, the touchscreen, etc. So let's talk about just basic form factor first. One gripe for me is that it only has an up and down articulating screen. So does my Sony a7 III. It's not the end of the world, but right now I'm shooting with my Sony a7 III and I have a 5-inch monitor on top of it, so I could even see if I'm in frame. And I wish they just did a fully articulating screen already, or at least what Panasonic is doing with the S1 series with the flip out, which at least for photography is helpful, because if I want to take some vertical pictures or street photography and want to look at the screen, well, yeah, I can't do that. That's a negative for me. But in terms of buttons and things like that, it's pretty standard overall. I would say that the Sonys do have a little bit more in terms of function buttons, but I think that the feeling of some of these buttons is nicer than the Sonys, certainly. The joystick, for one, is extremely usable, where in the Sony a7 III I find it's really hard to even move the focus point with it because it's so kind of shallow and it's hard to move. On this camera, I really like the feel of the focus joystick, which you need because this camera doesn't have the sort of touchscreen approach where your eye is to the viewfinder and you could use the touchscreen as sort of a trackpad. On the side, we have all of the necessary ports. We have USB, HDMI, which is this weird size. I don't know what it is, so I can't use it. It's like this 3/4 HDMI. It's not the mini one. It's not the full-size one. I'm sure it's great if you have the cable, but I don't, and it's certainly more tough than the micro HDMI would be. Now, for the biggest deal breaker for a lot of people when this camera was announced, the single card slot. I tend to agree, it's not ideal, especially if you're shooting anything professionally, weddings, but even sort of production video and stuff like that, it's nice to have that backup. When I'm shooting video on my a7 III, I always have 2 cards in there, and cards just aren't that expensive, and it's just worth that peace of mind, and well, you can't do it here. But that said, I do like the feel of the XQD. It feels more robust, and it feels like it's meant to take certainly more of a beating than SD cards are. Okay, so I switched over to 35 1.8, and although it's quite expensive, I will say it handles much better on this camera than the 24-70 does, just in the fact that it's smaller and lighter and more comfortable to sort of walk around with all day. The other one's not bad, don't get me wrong, but this is certainly more comfortable. So we're gonna try some long exposure. I have an ND4 filter on, and we're gonna see how long of a shutter speed that'll give us. Let's shoot some waterfalls. A half-second exposure first. Okay, I'm gonna try it again at 1 second, but I also did a -1/3 of a stop exposure compensation just to make sure I'm not blowing out my waterfall. In terms of dials and knobs, there is no dedicated exposure compensation. Also not the end of the world for me. There is an exposure compensation button, which you just push that and move your sliders, and that's actually totally fine. It's in a way better for me because I tend to move that knob by accident. So yeah, I don't mind that one at all. Same with ISO, there's a button for that. Now white balance doesn't get its own button, which is a bit of a bummer, but by default it is assigned to the function 1 button. Now in terms of the screens themselves, the viewfinder and the touchscreen are both very high res and nice to work with. What I really like here is that this camera is taking more advantage of the touchscreen, unlike the Sonys. And you could do things like navigating your menus and pinching to zoom and all that stuff, which Sony totally could enable, but for some reason they're afraid of touchscreens. I don't understand it. Come on, Sony, you can do it. There's even some really cool features, like when you're reviewing pictures on the back of the screen, if you tap, you'll get this little scroll bar to quickly scroll through all of your photos. And it kind of reminds me of the touch bar on the MacBook Pro, except for people don't hate this one, whereas, yeah, no one really likes that much. Anyway, it's really nice implementation of the touchscreen, and I like that they're being modern because frankly they're late to the game and they need to be modern. There is a dedicated recording button for video, and I actually like there's this sort of toggle between video mode and photo mode on the back. What I like about it, as opposed to the approach on other cameras where you're moving something on the dial, is that let's say you're in manual mode for your photography and you switch over to video, well then you're going to be in manual mode there. If you're in aperture priority mode and you switch over to video, then you're in aperture priority mode. So it's a little bit more straightforward for me, and I actually really like that approach. All right, so now let's take the camera around town, try out the eye autofocus and some of the other features as we check out downtown Clinton, New Jersey. Let's talk about the Wi-Fi and app implementation. People have really kind of on the Nikon SnapBridge app for a long time now, and I don't think it's warranted anymore. My experience has been pretty seamless in the limited testing I've done, but certainly once you set it up to Bluetooth, this thing gets my location every time, no issues, which is not something I could say on the Sony, which sometimes does lose the Bluetooth signal. And yeah, it's been seamless. It's been getting my location every time I've been shooting. In terms of the actual shooting with the app and things like that, I will say the biggest downside, while reviewing photos has been totally fine and pretty seamless and a nice experience, the biggest downside for me is with shooting, and that is that you seemingly can't touch to focus, which is just insane to me. Come on, guys. We want to be able to tap to focus. You know you can do this. Come on, Nikon. Other than that, SnapBridge has been really good. Two little freshmen new to the game sort of gripes that I have with this camera. One is with focusing. If you are in low light, in the version 1.1, I didn't find it stellar. I haven't done much testing with the 2.0 firmware. It is supposed to be improved. We will see. But one thing I did notice was that when you're in low light, this camera does this thing where it'll bump up the ISO as you're focusing, which I understand the technical reasons for that, except I don't really want to see it. So I wish they weren't going to show me that, because it's sort of disconcerting and it takes you out of shooting when your screen suddenly gets brighter and darker and does this little pulsing thing. Didn't really like that. The other thing is there's a setting in the menus that lets you see your live settings as you're adjusting them, which should mean depth of field and shutter speed and how they're going to affect your image. Except when I was actually testing that, I noticed that it actually stopped updating the depth of field preview after f5.6, which kind of sucks. So you have to assign one of your function buttons to be a depth of field preview, and when your function buttons are rather limited, it's kind of annoying to have to do that. Not the end of the world, but an annoyance nonetheless. Now, another form factor thing that I really like is that a lot of the new Nikon lenses have this extra wheel on it. And this 24-70 even takes it a step further with a display screen that will actually, you can switch what it's showing you, but if your wheel is controlling, let's say, your aperture, as you move it, you'll see the aperture actually on that tiny little display. I also like the top screen up here. It's something that I had when I shot Nikon DSLRs, and it's nice to see it here. And I also like that it's the sort of more modern black with white text OLED version. It actually adjusts to the brightness, and maybe this is a setting of the scene you're in. For instance, if you have your lens cap on, you'll see that that screen's really dim, and then you take it off and that screen will get brighter because it's sort of an ambient light sensor that's using the lens to do it. So I've spent the day shooting out here in Clinton, New Jersey, and the question remains, what do I think of the Nikon Z6? And overall, I actually really like it. I think it's the perfect balance of small and light, and something that you could hold all day with this sort of lens. Now, some of you might prefer a D850, and some of you may prefer a Sony a7 III, and a lot of that depends on your hands. But I think overall, the deep grip and the slightly longer body makes it really comfortable to hold. So yeah, I think this camera has a lot to offer, especially if you're coming from the Nikon system and have a lot of Nikon glass you already own. They've shown with this version 2.0 of the firmware that they're serious about this camera and that they're going to add features, which is always great in any system. I think overall this new competition is great for the market, and this camera is a good solid start for Nikon. Now, if you want everything that, say, the Sony a7 III offers, go for the Sony a7 III. But I do like that there's a lot of cool features in this that the a7 III doesn't have. For instance, they've really taken advantage of the touchscreen and let you use things in a more modern way than Sony has. One thing you should consider, however, is the overall cost of the system. Whereas the Nikon system is brand new and there's only a few lenses out there right now, the Sony system has already been expanded to third-party developers. So for instance, I'm shooting this right now with the Tamron 28-75, and well, that's a hell of a lot cheaper than this Nikon 24-70 or the Sony equivalent. And that's something you need to keep in mind. But of course, if you're going to buy all that first-party glass anyway, maybe it's not that big of a concern. I'm sure Nikon will get there with the glass, but if you want to try the camera out for yourself, I'd say rent it. Go over to our friends over at lensprotogo.com, use the coupon code down below. Let us know what you think of the camera in the comments. As always, please subscribe. We really appreciate it. Do it. No, really, do it.